Sometimes cities hide icons. Even places that have, for long periods of time, seemed distinct, obvious, or near to people's hearts may become forgotten. This is a story about noticing such a place. King Edward VII Park was proclaimed on the 9th of August 1902. It was set out in the veld west of the CBD of Bloemfontein and was meant as a gift of empire to commemorate the coronation of King Edward VII. But the story of the park actually started in 1860, when two members of the community decided to do something strange. In the expansive landscape of the young Orange Free State Republic, Carl Fichard and Dr. Krause decided to plant 30 to 40 willow trees west of the town. The spot became a favorite recreational space for residents. Maybe this doesn't sound strange to contemporary ears, but at the time, as can be seen in this 1866 panorama photograph taken by Charles Hamilton, Bloemfontein was a precarious settlement in the middle of a vast, dry landscape with very few trees. A photograph taken more than 40 years later, at about the time when the park was proclaimed, shows that the willow trees still stood as a lonely beacon in the veld. And yet, this venturesome act by Fichard and Krause had a big effect, because when King's Park was proclaimed, the town council decided to include the only mature trees in the area. Maps drawn at the time appear to indicate that this lonely clump of trees was one of the reasons behind the expansive size of the piece of land eventually set aside for the park. After its proclamation, the park was energetically cultivated. More than 125,000 trees were planted between 1904 and 1910. A zoo and a fountain were added in 1906, and in 1922 a large lake was completed which became known as Loch Logan. 3 years later, the centerpiece of this story was unveiled. In 1925, the Prince of Wales visited Bloemfontein and officially opened the Prince's Rose Garden, comprising 3,000 rose bushes and a reception area. What did the original layout of this garden look like? According to Karel Schoeman, people described the rose garden as being laid out in an irregular jazz fashion. When I first started researching the history of King's Park, it seemed that the layout of the old rose garden was another part of Bloemfontein's story lost to the forces of progress, since in the Mayor's Minute of 1938, it is mentioned that the Prince's Rose Garden was redesigned that year and, I quote, "the old paths done away with," close quote. But some stories have a way of resurrecting themselves. One fortuitous day, I was handed a box of uncatalogued photographs at the Free State Provincial Archive repository. What I found inside was a collection of 108 small aerial photographs of Bloemfontein taken along criss-crossing flight paths between October 1935 and January 1936. In the following weeks, I stitched, stretched, lens-corrected, blended and aligned these photographs to compose, as far as I know, the oldest complete aerial survey of Bloemfontein, with the added bonus of revealing the layout of King's Park in its prime. The first thing that catches one's eye is the scope of the main ornamental east-west axis through the park. This axis was originally anchored by the 1906 fountain and was later adorned with reflective lily ponds, manicured landscaping, and two commemorative monuments to soldiers that perished in the Second Anglo-Boer South African War. The ornamental gardens, reflective pools, and fountain was well documented in later photographs, but for the first time I saw the original layout of the Rose Garden next to Loch Logan. It was a gloriously venturesome thing, and despite the commanding central location of the reception area with pathways radiating in all directions, one could see why the original layout, with its loosely gathered ensemble of circles and walkways, seemed irregular or jazz-like to observers at the time. The Rose Garden was much admired, and it seems reasonable to argue that the memory of this garden may be one of the reasons that Bloemfontein is still known as the City of Roses. However, since the aerial photograph was taken, the park has steadily declined due to increasing pressures of spatial fragmentation, changing patterns of use, economic commodification, and societal transformation. Today, despite its prime location, the park is in a state of limbo. Besides the position of the central reception area, there's nothing left of the original Rose Garden. If one had to resurrect King's Park, I could think of no more potent symbol than this forgotten garden. Would it be possible to restore the Rose Garden? Obviously, one would want to approach this restoration in a way that ventures beyond the nostalgic reenactment of a colonial relic. Heritage markers are important for telling the story of a city, but the new Rose Garden will have to expand the heritage landscape. While following the dramatic jazz fashion layout of the original, it will have to tell a more inclusive story. On closer inspection, it became clear that the geometries of the old Rose Garden harbored the possibility to be creatively fused with a more place-specific, Free State form of expression, namely the Litema decorative pattern language developed by the Sesotho people of central South Africa. A future Rose Garden could offer a creative fusion of design languages, rooted in a historic venturesome act of gardening, but speaking of the social cohesion that the new democratic city aspires to. It was time to call in the help of architecture students. As part of a fourth-year architectural design project, where honours students had to reimagine and rescript the future of King's Park, it was decided to include our own venturesome creative experience. In the spirit of Figart and Krause, the decision was taken to chalk the outlines of the old Rose Garden. On 16 April 2021, an unfortunately windy day, 30 architecture students and their 2 intrepid lecturers, with the blessing of the Mangaung Parks and Cemeteries Department, the generous assistance of a local land surveyor, Lapis Labuschagne, and half a ton of chalk, set out to both trace and rescript on a 1-to-1 scale the layout of the lost Rose Garden.
Okay, so re tlile kwano Rose Garden ka fo mo inele Rose Garden gale re tlotla re troya ditema tsa rona jwale ka hale tseba ha o dilwa o tswa ditema jwale re tlotla re etsa ditema tseno re experiment re le bana ba sekolo sa University ya Free State.
In this specific spot after so many years, one can only sit here with memories. Although I'm not so old, I can talk about this garden over my experiences over the last 50 years. How it started off as an art market, when this was a very famous activity of social life in Bloemfontein. And it was also very much a heart of the Bloemfontein Rose Festival for many years. And it's now sad to see that this very important area in the center of Bloemfontein is not used by the people of Bloemfontein for the purpose of the park.
Ons is besig om die Roosstein uit te kalk, die lyne wat daar was. En ja, ons is almal besig om punte uit te lê en sirkels uit te lê en die tema te doen in die sirkels. alles met kalk en alles vir die argitektuurdepartement.
Well, we're marking out the rose garden, but I think it's a way of coming closer to the history of the city. Because when you don't interact with your city, it's easy to hate the city, and a lot of people hate easily on Bloemfontein. But when you actually do something like this, stand the whole day in the sun, it's hard work, but you appreciate it and you come closer to the heritage of the city.
I think I'm glad to actually learn about the history of Bloemfontein. Just going through this exercise of coming to this park has taught me a lot about Bloemfontein. And what we are doing today, we are tracing back those, that history, and not really just tracing back only, but also reinterpreting what it could be. So it's a balancing point of what the history used to be and what this could be.
I think I'm enjoying this process more than anything because we're also activating the space, a space that was used for people, but then now we are activating the edges and just learning more about the history of the Free State Bloemfontein per se, and just yeah.
It would have been possible to do something more permanent, but in the end, the evanescent trace offered by chalk felt very appropriate. Our ephemeral marks merely meant to record yet another venturesome moment of creative participation in the history of King's Park. A day when students took the measure of an urban memory, revealing what was there while broadening the horizon of associations connected to this historical place. The hope is that such acts of measuring will make it possible for others to once more dream about the potential gifts of this place. Shimmering places, like this nearly forgotten rose garden, hovering between recollection and obscurity, may call forth our care or entrench our indifference. Indifference can be avoided.